not only are we trying to demonstrate a new approach to treating PTSD, psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, but we're more broadly trying to demonstrate a new approach to provide healthcare and to provide prescription drugs in particular.
Welcome to the Worth the Fight podcast, where we bring you powerful conversations surrounding the sensible and therapeutic use of psychedelics and plant medicines towards healing trauma. I'll introduce you to guests who, through their own personal journey and transformation, tell the Worth the Fight story. I'm your host, Matt Simpson, author of Worth the Fight, Acting for a Better World, a guide to spirituality, psychedelic medicines, and overcoming trauma. Thank you for listening. My next guest on the Worth the Fight podcast is Rick Doblin PhD, the founder and executive director of the Multi-Disciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, which we talk about. Their unbelievable pioneering work every 2 to 3 episodes here on the Worth the Fight podcast. Rick received his doctorate in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where he wrote his dissertation on the regulation of the medical uses of psychedelics and marijuana. His professional goal is to help develop legal contexts for the beneficial uses of psychedelics and marijuana, primarily as prescription medicines, but also for personal growth for otherwise healthy people, and eventually to become a legally licensed psychedelic therapist. Rick founded MAPS in 1986 and currently resides in Boston with his wife, 2 dogs, and empty rooms from 3 children, one of whom is in college and 2 which have graduated. This podcast interview with Rick was one of my highest honors to date. This man has been knocking his head against the wall since the mid-'80s in the name of love for humanity, pushing forward MDMA-assisted psychotherapy and serving as an ambassador to these misunderstood psychedelic medicines in a time where there were virtually no one supporting this cause to restore the scientific merit and healing benefits of psychedelic medicines. He is the undisputed master of the long game approach to life, the it's the journey and not the destination mindset. Rick is a saintly man who wants to bring humane and compassionate care back to our world that struggles far too much with emotional and behavioral challenges. The first half of our interview, we talk about the incredible work being done by MAPS with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy in phase 3 clinical trials with our federal government, been labeled by the FDA a breakthrough therapy. In the second half, we talk about how these psychedelic medicines and this novel approach to mental health care has the potential to shift this entire mental health paradigm in time. MAPS's overarching goal is mass mental health for our great nation and human family. Without further ado, I give you my conversation with Rick Doblin, PhD, one of my heroes. Thank you so much for listening. Welcome to the show, Rick.
Man, thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to reach out to you and your audience.
Well, it was really great to connect with you at the Psychedelic Summit a few weeks back in Austin, Texas. Thank you for putting on these incredible events, sharing insightful science and where this movement is heading. Can you give us some updates about where MAPS is at? I talk about probably every second or third episode that I've done thus far. I'm touting the benefits, or I'm touting where you're at with the phase 2 moving into phase 3 and the phase 2 results that are ultra compelling, that really demonstrate that we have a cure, or you have a cure for PTSD. Of course, it has to make it through the clinical trials, but can you tell us a little bit about this vital work?
Yeah, and I would sort of put a little bit of a note of caution in the sense that, no treatment works for everybody. And there are people that really, after 1 or 2 or 3 sessions, their symptoms for PTSD are below the level of a diagnosis, which is tremendous because we work with severe PTSD, the hardest cases, some of whom have attempted suicide once or more times. I just had a situation where I learned about in our phase 3 study, which is underway right now. We had 1 person drop out of the study. Well, we've actually had 7 people drop out of the study. As far as we can tell, 6 of them dropped out because it was too difficult. And as far as we can guess right now, they were all in the placebo group, meaning they got therapy without MDMA, with inactive placebo.
Maybe they were frustrated they didn't get the MDMA.
Well, I think that's true. Although if they were to just stay in the study, and then by the end of the when we have finished the study and analyzed the data, then everybody that was in the placebo group can go through it again and get MDMA. So it looks like 6 people have dropped out, because they were frustrated they didn't get the MDMA, but also because the therapy was painful. And as far as we can tell, all of them were in the placebo group. We won't know for sure till we uncover the blind. But what I learned about today was a person who dropped out because the 2 sessions, it's a 3-session model, meaning that the sessions are 8 hours long. They're with the male-female co-therapy team. People usually spend the night in the treatment center and have more integrative psychotherapy before. And these sessions are 1 month apart, 3 to 5 weeks, 1 month apart. And there's 12 non-drug 90-minute psychotherapy sessions, also with both therapists. 3 before the first MDMA session for preparation and to bring in and build a therapeutic alliance. And then 3 of these integrative sessions after each MDMA with an experimental session to help people integrate it. And what I learned about today was one person who dropped out of the study after 2 sessions and said they accomplished what they want to do.
Wow.
And as far as we can guess, they all think this person had MDMA. So there's something fundamental about the way that MDMA helps people to process painful emotions and memories of trauma in a way that's different than they normally can, and that's unusually and exceptionally productive. More importantly, I would say, is that in our phase 2 data, we looked at how people were doing 2 months after the last experimental session and then compared the people that got therapy without MDMA with people that got therapy with MDMA. But then we also do a 12-month follow-up. And that's not so much for getting the drug approved, but that's for insurance companies. That's really to see if the benefits are durable. And what we are finding, and this is what I think is the most important point, is that people keep getting better. After the 2-month follow-up, when they're done with our treatment, they are motivated to do more therapy, to do other things, but they've learned that when difficult emotions come up, and their standard approach before had been to suppress the emotions or to try to tranquilize them with SSRIs, to mute their emotions, that didn't really have long-term benefits. And you stop taking the medications, the problems come back. And so what we're trying to do is a short-term, deep intervention that goes to the core of the problem, helps people learn how to heal themselves, how to process this trauma in a way that's productive. And then it seems that people are able to do that on their own afterwards, and they keep getting better. So the results are tremendously exciting. It's the results from our phase 2 studies are what persuaded FDA to designate MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD a breakthrough therapy.
Congratulations on that.
Yeah, thank you. Because 2/3 of the pharmaceutical company applications to FDA to have their drugs declared a breakthrough are rejected. So the FDA really tries to keep breakthrough therapy for the most important breakthroughs. And they're considering MDMA to be in that category.
Wow. So it appears as though I wrote in my book, in Worth the Fight, I cited that same aspect of the progress that patients are finding a year out, or how, it appears as though there's an inner healer that people are waking up to, or they're being equipped with more resiliency skills or ability, like you said, to lean into the difficult and to not numb it and to shy away from it. And that's one of the most exciting aspects about this, and about what this therapy, and I believe that holds true for experiences with ayahuasca and whatnot too. And my personal journey and what I've seen is that, it appears as though it does wake up an inner healer or a newfound way of looking at self-love and self-respect. And that's incredible that the data is supporting that.
Yeah, very much so. And this concept of the inner healer is very important. We all have that sense that, we scratch our body, and our body kind of has this self-organizing mechanism that tries to heal itself. And so the question is there something similar for the psyche? And this concept of the inner healer is a critical element in our therapeutic approach. So when you take MDMA or you take another psychedelic, or when you go to sleep at night and you have dreams, there's this membrane or barrier, you could say, between the conscious and the unconscious mind. And, in dreams with psychedelics, there's more of a flow from the unconscious to the conscious mind. And this concept of the inner healer is that there's some order or meaning or purpose for that flow, that we don't think of the therapist as guides. We're not guides. We don't know where people need to go. We know the general approach, but we feel that people's unconscious is their own guide. They're their own guide. And what emerges during this 8-hour session, in whatever order it emerges in, is there's a wisdom to that, this wisdom of the theoretical inner healer. And what we do is we support people to experience and express whatever is coming up, whether it's sensations in the body that they don't quite understand or that aren't connected to a story from their trauma, but just early sensations, or whether they're thoughts or memories. We don't say to people, we only want you to think about your trauma, and we only want to talk about your trauma. Oftentimes people will have these beautiful memories of things that happened to them, and that's like giving them strength then to go down into the pain. So we have an 8-hour session that's unscripted in terms of order, or we don't do guided imagery. We just basically play music, put headphones on and eye shades, and about roughly half the time, and it differs from patient to patient, but roughly half the time, people's eyes are closed, they're listening to the music, and they're having incredibly metaphorical, poetic imagery and stories that they are working through their own images. The other more or less half the time, they're talking with the therapist about what happened. But there's no particular order. And this concept of the inner healer is this faith that what comes up in whatever order, we'll find out there's a wisdom to it. And so we're not trying to steer people to particular kinds of experiences. We're just trying to help them process what's emerging in whatever order it's emerging. And I think we found that within this 8-hour session, we tell people at the beginning, if you don't bring up your trauma, we will bring it up. But we've never had to do it. People always come around.
Just comes up organically.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And so there's a variety of mechanistic reasons why we think this is working, why we think MDMA.
That was going to be my next question, was like, what's the mechanism here? This is incredible.
Oh, very good. Okay. Well, let's start by talking about PTSD. PTSD changes people's brains. So most people that are traumatized do not develop PTSD. We're resilient, we recover. It turns out that a lot of people, but not everybody, that's traumatized that does develop PTSD has had a series of other traumas, often earlier in their life, but not always the case. And so when you develop PTSD, though, it seems that your brain changes. It's independent of the cause of the PTSD. So if somebody had war-related PTSD or sexual assault-related PTSD or even natural disaster PTSD, what happens to their brains is similar regardless of the cause of PTSD. And what we see happening is the fear processing part of the brain, which we are calling the amygdala, that's hyperactive. The prefrontal cortex, where we think logically, there's reduced activity. And in the hippocampus, where we process memories into long-term storage, there's also reduced activity. So in a sense, you could say people are hyperreactive to fear-based cues and triggers. They're not thinking as logically, and they're not able to take these memories that are bothering them in major ways, and they're not able to process them and put them into the past. Like this happened in the past. It's like it's always about continually happening. So that's how PTSD changes your brain and changes people's lives in terribly destructive ways, particularly when it's severe PTSD, which is the kind of people that we're working with. So what MDMA does is it reduces activity in the amygdala, which means that people are not as fearful about difficult emotions and memories, that the fear itself is reduced so that you can remember and process without it being overwhelming. MDMA increases activity in the prefrontal cortex, where we think logically, so that you can say, oh, that sound is not the same sound as what I heard in the war, or that
you said it increases the MDMA increases
activity in the prefrontal cortex.
Okay.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
So that we're thinking more logically, and we're able to process complex thoughts more rationally. And MDMA also increases connectivity between the amygdala and the hippocampus, which is part of putting memories into the past. So we've had people in our studies say PTSD changed my brain and MDMA changed it back. Right.
Beautiful.
So MDMA also, there's been incredible studies that were just published in Nature, which is one of the top scientific journals in the world, that were done by researchers at Johns Hopkins in mice. And what they showed is that MDMA released oxytocin, which is the hormone of love, of nurturing, nursing mothers, orgasm, it's bonding, it's the connection. The oxytocin is released with MDMA, and also that it promotes new neural connections. So basically what you're doing when you take MDMA in the prosocial area of your brain, you're strengthening the connections in the prosocial area of your brain, and you're developing a therapeutic alliance. You're developing trust and connection with the people that you're with. And I think this oxytocin is really very important as a way to understand what MDMA does. And in fact, there's a German doctor, Torsten Passy, psychiatrist, who's written a paper comparing MDMA and the physiological activity of MDMA to the post-orgasmic state. And I think that's a really good way to think about it. You're not striving, you're peaceful, you're open, you're connected. It's kind of a beautiful thing. Now, there's also been studies by these same neuroscientists from Johns Hopkins in octopuses. And these are pretty funny. I like talking about this particular study. So what had happened is that octopuses and humans diverged about 550 million years ago.
Long time ago.
Long time ago. However, it turns out that octopuses still have a serotonin system. And the question is, what does it do? So octopuses are asocial creatures, unless it's mating season, which is not very often. So they are solitary creatures. When you put an octopus in water that's got MDMA in it, and they figured it out after a while, and you soak this octopus in this water, the experiment is that there are an octopus in the center that can move. There's two chambers, one on either side, and one of them has an inanimate object, like a ball, in a little cage, so it can't move. On the other side is another octopus, also in this kind of little cage, so it can't move. Under normal circumstances, the octopus spends way more time with the inanimate object than with the other octopus. And when it's with the other octopus, it's not really spending much time near the octopus. It's around the perimeter of that area. However, you soak the MDMA, you soak the octopus in water that has MDMA in it for 10 minutes. You put the octopus back in the contraption, and all of a sudden it spends way more time with the other octopus.
It's cuddling with the other octopi at that point.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
Okay, so what that shows is that whatever MDMA does in this pro-social way goes so deep into our evolutionary history, into our psyches, that there's something incredibly powerful about it. Now, just interestingly, the FDA has said that if we succeed in adults and demonstrate safety and efficacy, and if it's the case that FDA approves it for prescription use, then we are being required to do studies in adolescents that have trauma from 12 to 17-year-olds. Right now, we're going down to 18-year-olds. So what makes me think it'll work in adolescents that are traumatized is this idea that something in so deep in our evolutionary history promotes this prosocial behavior that it goes deeper than language and deeper than any kind of sort of sophisticated thinking. So in any case, MDMA seems to do exactly what we need a drug to do to help treat PTSD. And more importantly than that, it does it in such a deep way that you don't need to keep taking the MDMA.
That's beautiful. Yes. How this potentially has the potential to disrupt in a loving manner the pill a day model that we've all been led to believe is part of the human experience.
Yeah, exactly. The whole concept that we are doing nonprofit drug development means that we are not trying to sell the most MDMA. Our goal is to help people to get the best outcomes and to do it with at least cost, with the least amount of therapy and the least amount of MDMA. Beautiful. So it's different than the SSRIs, which reduce symptoms but don't get to the cure, don't get to the core of the problem, and that need to be taken on a daily basis for months or years or decades sometimes. And when you stop taking them, often the problems come back.
Yeah, this model goes straight to the root of the problem and addresses it in a loving manner with a very comprehensive protocol that you've eloquently shared with us. That it's incredible to see how this is a potential game changer for this whole healing model that we have.
Yeah. Now, we have been trying very hard to educate the Veterans Administration and also the Department of Defense about the potential of MDMA. We've been working since 1990, actually, approaching the VA about us trying to fund studies inside the VA so that they could learn about it, how the potential of MDMA to help PTSD. The political people have always said no. The people, the therapists and psychiatrists that are close to the patients have always said yes. Mm-hmm. And we think now that we're about at a breakthrough. It's only taken 29 years. And we're working with Rachel Yehuda at the Bronx VA. And
she's the most esteemed PTSD researcher.
Yeah, she's very much. She's done work on multi-generational trauma. She's looked at Holocaust survivors and their children and showed how certain genetic changes are passed on from the generations. It's called epigenetics, or over the genes. It's not that the genes are changed in that one generation. That takes a lot longer, very, very long. But what is changed is which genes get turned on and off. And so not only are we trying to treat trauma, but we are trying to break the cycle of multi-generational trauma that often has conflicts going down the generations from decades and centuries. I mean, look at some of these conflicts that are thousands of years old. So what we are seeing is this opportunity to try to educate the VA. The other thing that we're doing is we have a method that we have standardized. People could go to the MAPS website, maps.maps.org.
I'll put that in the show notes too.
Okay, great. And go to the research section and then just go to MDMA. And at the bottom of that page, you can read our treatment manual that describes our therapeutic approach. But part of our effort to educate the VA is that we are working with leading Veterans Administration researchers who've developed a variety of therapies for PTSD. And we are paying for them to blend MDMA with their existing therapies.
So you guys are paying them instead of them
Yeah.
but it's a start.
It's a start. Now, as of September 2018, so more than a year ago, there was 1,036,000 veterans receiving disability payments for PTSD. And that was the third most frequent cause of disability payments to veterans. The first two were hearing loss and tinnitus, ringing in the ears, just from all the noise and explosions.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we've been able to acknowledge is that the cost of war and the traumatization of soldiers is just enormous. And so these million veterans plus, 1,036,000 veterans as of over a year ago, are mostly young people. And they're going to be on disability payments for the next 30, 40, 50 years or 60 years. It's just an enormous burden. And so we have not yet gotten a penny from the VA or the Department of Defense to help us do this research. It's all been private donations because it's been controversial with psychedelics, but we're hoping to get over that controversy, and we're hoping to make this more of a mainstream thing. So the three main therapies that are prevalent throughout the Veterans Administration, one is called prolonged exposure. The theory there is that you just talk about your trauma over and over and over until it no longer triggers you. That's very painful for some people.
It sounds like it. Yeah. It sounds like that would be tremendously painful.
Yeah. I mean, some people it can work and help them, but a lot of people just drop out. It's too much. There's also cognitive behavioral therapy, which tries to adjust your thinking about things. Like you're triggered by somebody wearing a red hat because you were attacked by somebody wearing a red hat, but not everybody who wears a red hat is going to attack you. So you try to use these kind of cognitive tricks to help you not be so triggered. And cognitive processing therapy is similar to cognitive behavioral therapy. And so we are paying to have MDMA blended with these three different therapeutic approaches. And there's a modification of the cognitive behavioral therapy that's called cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. Conjoint meaning couples or dyads. And it's where one has PTSD, but it affects the relationship. The other person doesn't have PTSD. So we brought both people into the treatment and give both of them MDMA. And it's been tremendously helpful, both for the relationships and also for the person who had PTSD. So what I'm basically saying is that this discussion sort of began on the focus on the inner healer and how that leads towards our therapeutic method, which is unscripted and supports people with whatever's coming up. But these other methods can be helpful, and we're not saying that we have the only or the best method, but we are trying to explore other approaches as a way to really educate the leaders of the opinion leaders and the main researchers internationally in the field of the treatment of PTSD.
I was going to ask, well, why do you think why is there resistance here? This has been labeled a breakthrough therapy by the FDA. Both MDMA-assisted therapy and psilocybin-assisted therapy have both been labeled breakthrough therapies. Why is there the resistance? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think we're just coming out of a 50-year period of a backlash against psychedelics, starting in the 60s. And I think our culture has, in large part, learned a lot of the lessons of the 60s, integrated a lot of those things. So, for example, meditation was the gurus and the Maharishi Yogi, transcendental meditation, and these people in robes coming from India and teaching about meditation. And that was considered strange and weird in the 60s. Also, yoga. People were terrified of yoga, that you're going to be doing this and you're going to be somehow or other converted to another religion or so. People didn't really talk about death. The first hospice in America was 1974. Women were tranquilized when they gave birth. Men were not allowed in the delivery room. And so that has changed. We have 6,500 hospice centers in the United States now. We have mindfulness and meditation, yoga at your local YMCA all over the place. So I think that the culture in many ways has gotten over this resistance. But some of the resistance is even from psychiatrists or psychotherapists who are frightened themselves about losing control. That part of our approach is we don't require it, but we encourage therapists that will work with patients with MDMA to take MDMA themselves as a patient, to really see how the therapy is delivered to them. And it's quite interesting. Most people are very enthused about it, but we've had some psychiatrists say that they don't want to participate because they're scared of losing control, or what if something would come up?
What will come up in their...
Yeah. So I think that's the main resistance now. I'd say that the backlash was about psychedelics being connected with the counterculture, and psychedelics being a symbol of rebellion, and people are going to leave, turn on,
tune out and drop out. Yeah.
And we see now that that's not really happened, that there's loads of people with psychedelics who, stayed in and participated and made great contributions. So the resistance is no longer about this is a symbol of cultural rebellion, at least in most people's minds. And there are people that still are against psychedelics because they think it's going to lead to cultural rebellion and dissolution. But I think the main resistance that we have is about the sense of losing control, that what is inside us. And, some people have this view that, civilization is there to protect us from our animal instincts. And, we need these kind of civilizations, and we need to keep suppressing things. But I think other people feel that, the more you suppress something, it gets warped and twisted. And if you can bring these things to the surface, there's a better way to deal with them.
Absolutely.
You don't go along and express everything that you feel, or you don't, act things out, but still that there's a different way. So I think the other resistance, one of the big issues for us is, how do we get insurance to pay for it?
Gotcha.
So this doesn't meet the model of a 45-minute or 50-minute hour once a week. It's an 8-hour day. So for the VA, how do they fit what we're doing into their system where they're already so overloaded with vets with PTSD that they see therapists, once every couple of weeks for an hour? How do we work within the system to have 8-hour sessions? And not only that, but have a 2-person therapy team. Mm-hmm. One of them licensed therapist, the other eventually will just be a student working to get their license. But I think this fear of what's inside ourselves, the fear of losing control, there's also, the structural fears, as I've said. So I think the resistance is largely fading because there's a lot of sympathy for these people that are suffering. And
suffering in droves, with the the veteran suicide, the increase in depression, addiction rates. We're struggling at all ages in mental health.
Yeah, and so I think that's really motivating people out of compassion to get over what the resistances are and pay attention to what's going on here.
Beautiful. Well, there's so much to unpack, and I really appreciate you taking the time to break down how this therapy works and really plant seeds of where this is going. I agree that there's so much in our culture right now that was taboo in the 60s and 70s that now is very much a part of our culture. Something that has resonated deeply with me and has shifted and changed the way that I look at these medicines and helped me really understand my personal healing of overcoming childhood sexual trauma and struggled with depression and addiction, and to be a 35-year-old man who has a profound healing experience. It was the book Stealing Fire that was really helpful for me. The way that Jamie Wheel, who just had that great talk at your benefit dinner in Austin, and how Stephen Kotler, how they break down the neuroscience, and really seeing the Tim Ferrisses, the Aubrey Marcuses, the Joe Rogans, and the way that these luminaries are retelling the story about what it means to be human and tying these medicines with peak performance, as opposed to almost the opposite of the dropout of society. It's like, no, let's use these as creative agents to heal, get right, get fit for service, and ultimately find a way to channel our energies towards service.
Yeah, I think that's so right.
So I'm glad that we're in a time right now where I think that the 60s and 70s, they paved the way for this renaissance. I'm just elated at the potential of your work means for the masses that are struggling right now as we're slowly changing that story and scrubbing that stigma. And like I said in that email that I'd sent you a few days back, your plea on Tami Simon's Insight at the Edge for people to speak up about these experiences. I think the power of story is the most powerful tool that we have to change the hearts and minds of people. I took that as a call to action, and that was one of the motivating factors to start this podcast, is to have a platform where people could come on and share openly and honestly and transparently about their own journeys of overcoming and responsibly using these medicines to heal and get right and ultimately become better people for their loved ones in circles of influence. So thank you.
Yeah. And what you said about the call to service. So I just want to talk a little bit about Abraham Maslow, who was basically one of the key figures in humanistic psychology. And a lot of people know about this, who've studied psychology a little bit, about this hierarchy of needs that he's sort of famous for. And the idea is that you have these initial needs for food, water, rest, your physiological needs. And once they're satisfied, you also have these safety needs for security. Then you have needs for love and belonging, for relationships, friends, partners. Above that, you have esteem, feelings of accomplishment. And then on the top of that is called self-actualization, where you achieve one's full potential. That's this hierarchy of needs that many people think, is one of Maslow's main contributions. And you could see how, in a way, for a libertarian kind of an approach, this self-actualization, that's what we're all trying to do, is become our full selves. But in the last few years of his life, Maslow changed his hierarchy of needs. As he started getting more engaged with the research from psychedelics, the research from non-ordinary states of consciousness, and what he put above self-actualization was self-transcendence, which means basically helping others and having a sense of meaning in the larger world, in the whole. So I think this sense of service is what really is how we really fulfill our potential. It's not just achieving one's full potential in and of itself for your own self, that this process of going beyond that, beyond the ego, and that's where I think psychedelics are so important, to help us do this self-transcendence and service of others. And that's really, I think, this concept that this therapy helps people work through their traumas, but psychedelics in general can also help people have this spiritual sense of connection, and that it's that sense of connection that moves one to service.
Beautiful. And that's what we need. There's enough people hurting right now. And I know from my personal experience, when I shifted my orientation towards service, that was the best form of therapy that I could ever get. The helper high, and when you're helping others, our problems, when we all have shit, become more meaningless. And yeah, this is beautiful that the psychedelics seem to promote that, and the more prosocial behavior and a deeper, more full understanding of ourselves in relation to our brothers and sisters and the natural world.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Wonderful. Was something that came up for me, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the non-for-profit angle that, you guys have. MAPS is a social, or it's a non-for-profit, but you've started a social benefit corporation. I'm not fully understanding. I'm curious as to how this has the potential to shift the economic model that we have. Maybe it's premature to mention this book. I usually like to read things twice before I start citing and whatnot. My mind's been racing this week with reading Simon Sinek's book, The Infinite Game. Have you heard of that book?
No, I haven't. Actually.
Yeah, he wrote a profound. He's one of the original TED Talkers that, he had a TED Talk that I think is a top 5 of all time that was Start With Why. And he's got a bold stance and aggressive platform of really describing the infinite game. And his problem with capitalism is that so many of us, we play the finite games, which, there's winners and losers. And, he's incorporating the journey thinking, which I think is very psychedelic, but into the economic models. For example, capitalism is at its basis is to serve the consumer. And we've lost that. We've shifted away from that in a lot of aspects. The idea that you guys are doing such tremendous work and have a potential to help shift the model. Can you speak a little bit about how this social benefit corporation, how this will all shake out?
Yeah.
I got a little tangential there with, I'm not sure
that was good.
Tied that all together.
But I'll say that not only are we trying to demonstrate a new approach to treating PTSD, psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, but we're more broadly trying to demonstrate a new approach to provide healthcare and to provide prescription drugs in particular. So that most drug companies are for-profit companies, and we Americans pay the highest prices for drugs anywhere else in the world. If you look at a lot of what's going on with drug pricing, you really got to question. It's really about maximizing the income and the profits for the drug companies. And American healthcare in general is so warped out of recognition by the profit motive that Americans pay more per person for healthcare than anywhere else in the world, but our outcomes are way lower than a lot of other countries in the world. And that's because there's so much money being siphoned off by insurance companies, drug companies, all sorts of for-profit entities. So in addition to trying to make MDMA-assisted psychotherapy into a medicine, we're trying to demonstrate a new way to sell prescription medicines. So as it turns out, MDMA was invented in 1912 and is off patent. In the late 1980s, early 1990s, I hired a patent attorney to develop an anti-patent strategy. So nobody could patent any of the uses of MDMA, because I didn't want us to be working on MDMA for PTSD and then somebody else come along and say, oh, I got a patent on it. So we've made it pretty impossible for people to get patents on all of the currently known uses of MDMA. Turns out, I didn't even know this till about 7 years ago, but it turns out that Ronald Reagan passed a law in 1984 to provide incentives for developing drugs that are off patent. And these incentives are called data exclusivity. So what that means is that if we are the first ones to make MDMA into a medicine for PTSD, which it looks like we will be, nobody can use our data to market a generic for 5 years. And as I said before, we have to do pediatric studies to get an extra 6 months incentive extension on data exclusivity. And then nobody can apply to market a generic until this 5.5 year period is over. And it takes FDA at least 6 months or more to review the application. So we'll likely have 6 years of data exclusivity for PTSD, for MDMA. In Europe, it's 10 years. So once I realized that we had a different story we could tell our donors, which is that we're not going to keep asking you for money all the time to make MDMA into medicine for PTSD, and then for social anxiety, and then for helping people with OCD or depression or anxiety related to life-threatening illnesses or eating disorders, which we're about to start a study. So it's constantly, asking for money. So what we said is, no, now we have a chance to make some money selling MDMA. But doing that is something that is taxable. It shouldn't stay in the nonprofit. And so we had to create a different company. And we looked around and we did not want to create a for-profit maximizing company that would sell MDMA. And so it turns out that there's a modification of capitalism called the Public Benefit Corporation, where you maximize public benefit, not profit. And so MAPS has created the for-profit Public Benefit Corporation, and that's what we're going to use to sell MDMA. There's only one investor in that, which is the nonprofit. So the nonprofit is the 100% owner of the Public Benefit Corp. And the way that we're going to market MDMA, and we're developing all sorts of metrics to quantify what is public benefit and how do we evaluate it. It's sharing information, putting our protocols on the website, helping other people. A big part of what we're doing, and this is, I'd say, very rare for a pharmaceutical company and very controversial, is that we believe that the pharmaceutical approach, eventually to be covered by insurance, is very essential. It's very important. But from a human rights perspective, the drug war is counterproductive. It increases problems. And people should have access to MDMA outside of having to go to their doctor or going to a religious freedom, trying to claim a church. So we're actually trying to support efforts for drug policy reform so that people don't have to get it from us. And they can try to heal themselves. And we think what will end up is that only the most difficult cases will go to the therapists. But the sad part is there'll be so many more of those that the therapists will be busy no matter what. So the goal is then that we will sell MDMA at a reasonable profit. Most of the money for treatment is going to go to the therapist, not to the drug, because it's really drug-assisted psychotherapy. Mm-hmm. And whatever money is made will be then reinvested in more research. And so that's the basic concept that we have.
Wonderful. I appreciate you breaking that down. And it's a novel approach. And like we've been talking about, just by virtue of the people that are struggling, our current systems are not working. So kudos to you and your team for the strategic planning to potentially overhaul, slowly, of course, this broken mental health paradigm.
Yeah, and we do think that there is a lot of hope. I mean, there's roughly 20 veterans a day committing suicide. If we could provide MDMA therapy, we think that there would be very few. And sadly, that's over 7,000 a year. And
that number's likely far greater. I mean, that's a central part of my messaging, and it doesn't include the homeless and those that are stuck in self-abuse. And I referenced this conversation that you had with Aubrey Marcus on his podcast. I believe it was summer of 2018. I was really deep in the research. You had forecasted that based on the way everything was going at the time, summer of 2018, that 2035 would be the year that we would see a post-prohibition world where we've shifted the model and it's legal both recreationally and medically. With the advancements and all of the shifts and changes in the last year and a half, has that forecast shifted as well?
No, and so let me give you a sense of where we're at. So
okay.
We're in the midst of phase 3. We have to do 2 studies, each a minimum of 100 people. We've enrolled 66 people in our first of our 2 phase 3 studies. We have 2 sites in Israel, 2 sites in Canada, and 11 sites throughout the United States. And if anybody is listening and wants to volunteer, just go to clinicaltrials.gov and you put in MDMA PTSD and you'll get our listing, and you can see where the sites are, and you can volunteer if you want to be a subject. But we now have the 2/3 basically are enrolled in the first study. We will have what's called the interim analysis, where we have an unblinded data monitoring committee looks at the data and then lets me know if we need to add any more subjects to get statistical significance or not. So April is really when we'll know how well we're doing, how long it's going to take, how many subjects, how much it's going to cost. We anticipate completing phase 3 by the middle of 2021. And we anticipate submitting all the data and getting FDA approval, and this is again contingent upon the data, near the end of 2021 or the first quarter or first half of 2022. Then what's going to be happening, and this is sort of building to this 2035 date, what's going to be happening then is psychedelic clinics. So we have been negotiating with FDA and DEA already, and what we are proposing is that the only people that can treat patients with PTSD, the only people that can prescribe and treat patients, are those that have been through the training program. So because it's not really the drug, it's drug-assisted psychotherapy, and the therapeutic approach is key. And that MDMA, once it's a prescription medicine, can only be administered under direct supervision in these clinic settings. But these clinics will eventually expand to providing ketamine, providing MDMA, providing psilocybin, and other psychedelics as they come down the road. So what I think will happen is that from 2022 or so, for another 10 plus years, we will be building out, and therapists will be building out all these psychedelic clinics. And we'll end up with thousands and thousands of clinics all around the United States. And people will end up knowing people that have been helped by psychedelic psychotherapy. And I think that what we're also going to be having, and we see this happening at an accelerating rate, which is the legalization of marijuana, not just for medicine, but for adult uses, recreational uses. And Canada has already done that on a federal level. The US is moving in that direction. Today, the House Judiciary Committee passed the marijuana legalization bill that's going to go to the full House.
Wow.
So I think that what we're going to end up having is a decade or more of psychedelic clinics and people getting more comfortable with, under certain circumstances, more benefits than risks from psychedelics. And the more that people know people that have benefited, the more their attitudes will change. And I think eventually then we will get to a point where we'll recognize that the risks of these drugs are there, but the best way to address them is not through prohibition, but through some sort of licensed legalization and harm reduction and honest drug education. And so I think by 2035, our society will have wised up enough that we'll just say there's benefits and there's risks, and the way to maximize benefits and reduce risks is to move beyond prohibition and come up with a different approach. And this idea of licensed legalization, I'll just say that when we think about alcohol and we think about drunk drivers, what we think about is a lot of times people have lost their driver's license because they've been caught driving under the influence, but they can still go out and buy alcohol, and they still often get back in the car drunk and kill people. Mm-hmm. So we should make it harder for people who have been convicted of drunk driving. We should make it harder for them to drive, but also harder for them to get alcohol. So I think if there's a license to do drugs, and we all know you can get your credit card authenticated, approved in seconds, anywhere you go, there should be a license to do drugs. And if you misbehave on those drugs, you get punished for your misbehavior, but then you also lose your license to buy it. And there'll be a black market and all, but I think it will substantially make it more difficult to find for people that lost their license to find drugs. And so I think that that's the long-term trajectory. And I'll just add that our goal is mass mental health. It's so stressful dealing with climate change, dealing with authoritarian governments, dealing with dictators, dealing with wars, dealing just with the pain of life, dealing with death, that we need mass mental health. And that is our goal. And that's where the research that we're doing, the Public Benefit Corporation, the way we assist everyone that we can in doing their own research, that's where it's all headed to, mass mental health and hopefully a more spiritualized world with a lot less trauma.
Beautifully said. And thank you for laying out a forecast of, kind of real-time state of the Psychedelic Union address. And we appreciate that. And that's exciting. And there's so much to be optimistic about. And my heart and my work is so invested with our war veterans that are struggling in the midst of this mental health crisis. And I look out a generation or two, and having been so immersed in this work for the last 3+ years, since my work with Ryan at Veterans for Entheogenic Therapy, and thinking that, if we earnestly seek a peaceful planet, healing the hearts and minds of our war veterans is an absolute must. They can teach us everything that we're ignoring as a people. Part of my messaging is tying this unchecked church abuse, this church sex abuse that we've seen time and time again. And the work with that, it was in 90% of the cases, it wasn't the arm that was missing. It wasn't the foot that was blown off in war. It wasn't losing a buddy in war. Time and time again, it came down to the childhood sexual trauma in the early years of development. And Sebastian Junger's research in Tribe, he wrote this profound book about PTSD, homecoming, and belonging. And he has a troubling statistic that shows that modern day veterans that fought in Iraq and Afghanistan are 2 times more likely to report childhood sexual trauma than those, or in the early years of childhood development, than those that fought at random in Vietnam. I mean, that is something that I believe, and I'm kind of out on a limb here with this, and I'm going to keep beating this drum. I believe this unchecked church abuse that starts with the Catholic Church is at root of, for a good majority of the war and conflict we see here. It's not always a popular stance to have, but if we want to solve this war challenge, that healing the hearts and minds of our war veterans, they raise their hands. When they do, us civilians, we all shut up, we listen, and having this be potentially a love-based solution, since we can't wait till 2035 until this is all legal, pushing forward in an aggressive, offensive manner to get this healing to our war veterans that are, again, dropping like flies to suicide. What are your thoughts and impressions on that? And yeah, I know I just threw a lot at you, and we're winding down our call here too. So
I'll just say I'm tremendously optimistic and hopeful. I mean, I really think that the pressures of the world that a lot of people are facing are, in a way, challenging people's sense of isolation. You could say the upside of global warming is that we're all in it together, and people are realizing that these other boundaries that we've had of our race, our nationality, our gender, our religion, our socioeconomic status, that they're arbitrary and that they don't go so deep, that fundamentally we're all the same. We're all part of the human family. We're all part of the web of life on Earth. The more we see pictures of the Earth from space, the more we realize that. And so I think there's lots and lots of struggles, but there is this emerging sense of spirituality that people are hungry for. And that's where I think we have, earlier you asked about the resistance to psychedelics, but there's also something very compelling. People are wanting these kind of experiences. And I think that all of that leads me to be very hopeful. And at the same time, we have to acknowledge the fears and the anxieties and help people to deal with them as much as we can. But in general, I'm just very optimistic.
Wonderful. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for taking this time. Thank you so much for walking this path with integrity, and your leadership has been instrumental to so much of the goodness and the beauty and the optimism that we have here. And on my personal journey, kind of pushing some of this work out into the unknown, it's been extraordinarily hopeful to hear the way that you share openly and honestly, and all the little breadcrumbs that you've shared along the way that have helped me take a long game approach. Chill the F out, man. It's part of the long game, and it was a profound realization that I had on one of your podcasts where you had said that the expectation, or that the result was never really important. And for me, that's love, is giving for the sake of giving with no expectation of result. And thank you for giving your whole heart to this movement and to our human family. And again, I'm just wowed and proud and grateful for the work that you're doing. Are there any parting words that you'd like to share with our audience here?
Yeah, just to say that we're doing all of this through donations rather than investments. And if anybody wants to donate, just go to the MAPS website. We're having a year-end campaign, and that would be very helpful.
Wonderful. I'll put all this into the show notes. Again, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule, and can't wait to connect on the next time around.
Yeah, and thank
Much
you
appreciation.
for helping spread the word.
Absolutely.
Wow, we just heard the psychedelic State of the Union from a man that many call the godfather of this burgeoning psychedelic renaissance. If you enjoyed this show, please subscribe. We have many more insightful and inspired guests in the queue. I started this podcast because I knew I could deliver high vibe content, serving as a messenger and living proof of the therapeutic value of these misunderstood medicines. I believe these open, honest, and transparent conversations about psychedelic medicines, trauma, and our war veterans in the midst of a mental health crisis are vital conversations. We are 10 episodes in the Worth the Fight podcast journey. If you found value in this content and are in a financial position to support the show, please consider monthly donations on Patreon. This podcast is truly a labor of love for me, but it takes a lot of time, and I too must keep the lights on. Please help me continue to deliver this valuable content to our human family. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for your support.